The rain over Frankfurt in the late autumn of 1945 didn't wash away the ash. It just turned it into a thick, gray paste that clung to the boots of every soldier in the Third Army. General George S. Patton Jr. sat in the rear of his armored Cadillac, his gloved hand resting heavily on the ivory handle of his Colt .45. He stared out the smeared window at a world reduced to jagged teeth of brick and shattered glass. To his men, he was an iron giant, a warrior who wept only for fallen heroes and had no patience for the defeated. But that morning, a single obstacle in the mud would force the old general to look directly into the eyes of the enemy's future and confront a secret that a shattered country was desperately trying to hide. The car ground to a sudden, wrenching halt, the tires slipping on wet cobblestones. Up front, Corporal Thomas Miller cursed softly under his breath, shifting the gears back into neutral. Through the downpour, a figure had stepped out from the ruins of a bombed-out bakery directly into the path of the convoy. It wasn't a sniper or a desperate partisan, but a young woman, barely 20, her blonde hair matted against her skull, wearing a threadbare coat that looked 3 sizes too big. In her arms, wrapped in a stiff, grease-stained burlap sack, she held a bundle close to her chest. She wasn't running. She stood perfectly still, her face pale as chalk, staring directly through the windshield at the silver stars on the car's bumper. Miller reached for his service rifle, his knuckles turning white. He told the general that he would clear the road, warning that the locals were getting desperate enough to use children as decoys for ambushes. Patton didn't move a muscle, his eyes narrowing as he watched the girl. She didn't look dangerous. She looked hollow, like a ghost that had forgotten how to fade away. Instead of reaching into her coat for a weapon, she did something that made Miller pause. She dropped to her knees in the freezing mud, lifting the burlap bundle toward the sky like an offering. Her lips. Patton opened the door before his security detail could react, the cold German wind instantly biting at his face. He stepped into the mud, his polished riding boots sinking into the grime, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. He walked toward her, the gravel crunching beneath his feet, his towering figure casting a long shadow over the kneeling girl. When he stopped a few feet away, he didn't see hatred in her eyes. He saw a terrifying, absolute emptiness. She looked up at the legendary commander, her voice trembling so violently the words seemed to fracture in the air. She spoke in broken English, begging not for her life, nor for bread, but for a single bottle of milk for the baby in her arms. The general looked down at the bundle. A tiny, blue-tinged face peeked out from the rough fabric, its breathing shallow and ragged. Patton's chest tightened, a familiar flicker of anger sparking in his veins. He had seen the horrors of the camps. He had seen what the regime this girl belonged to had done to the world. He told her coldly that the stores of the American military were for the victims of her country's madness, not for the citizens who had cheered it on. He turned to walk away, believing this was just another civilian looking for a handout from a soft-hearted conqueror. But as he took his first step, the girl cried out a phrase that stopped him dead in his tracks. She didn't say please. She screamed that the child wasn't hers, and that if it died, the truth about the missing soldiers of the 42nd Division would die with it. Patton spun back around, his eyes flashing like lightning. He grabbed the girl by the arm, lifting her from the mud with an unexpected roughness born of sudden adrenaline. He demanded to know what she meant, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the sound of the rain. The girl, whose name was Elsa, choked back a sob, her fingers tightening around the baby. She whispered that the child's mother was gone, taken by the night, and that the baby carried a bloodline that mattered to the men who wore the same uniform as the general. She begged him again, promising to tell him everything if he would just save the child first. The general looked at the baby again. Its eyes were closed, its skin dry and paper-thin. Patton knew the rules of engagement. He knew the strict orders regarding non-fraternization and the rationing of medical supplies. But he also knew the names of every man he had lost, and the nagging ache of the ones who had simply vanished into the fog of war. He barked an order to Miller to bring the girl into the back of the Cadillac. The corporal hesitated, reminding the general of the safety protocols, but one sharp look from Patton silenced him instantly. Within moments, the girl was sitting on the plush leather seat, shivering uncontrollably, leaving streaks of gray mud on the pristine interior. As the convoy sped toward the temporary headquarters in an intact villa on the outskirts of the city, Patton remained silent. He didn't look at Elsa, nor did he offer her his drywall coat. He simply watched her out of the corner of his eye as she rocked the silent bundle, hummed a faint, fractured lullaby that sounded more like a dirge. The air in the car grew heavy with the scent of damp wool, engine grease, and the distinct, unmistakable odor of prolonged starvation. Patton reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver flask, and took a slow drink, his mind racing through the thousands of intelligence reports he had read over the past 6 months. When they arrived at the villa, Patton bypassed the main briefing room, leading Elsa down a side corridor into a small, secluded office normally used by the quartermaster. He ordered a medic to bring a bottle of warmed milk and a clean blanket, specifying that no one else was to enter the room. The medic returned quickly, his eyes wide with curiosity at the sight of the Supreme Commander standing guard over a ragged German civilian. Patton took the bottle himself, dismissing the medic with a sharp nod. He turned to Elsa, holding out the milk, his face expressionless. He told her that the child had its food, and now it was time for her to pay her debt. Elsa took the bottle with trembling hands, her knuckles raw and bleeding from the cold. She didn't feed the baby immediately. Instead, she pressed the warm glass against her own cheek for a brief second, closing her eyes as if remembering what warmth felt like. Then, with a tenderness that seemed entirely detached from the harshness of her surroundings, she began to feed the infant. The child sucked weakly, a faint sound of life returning to its throat. Patton watched the scene unfold, his arms crossed over his chest, his boots clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. He told her the clock was ticking, and he wanted the names of the missing Americans. Elsa looked up, her eyes glistening with tears that refused to fall. She explained that she had been a nurse's assistant at a makeshift hospital near the eastern edge of the city during the final days of the battle. When the bombs fell and the leadership fled, the wounded were abandoned to the darkness. Among them were 3 American prisoners of war, men who had been captured during the winter retreat. She said she had watched over them, hiding them in the cellar beneath the rubble as the city crumbled around them. One of those men, a young lieutenant with a silver ring shaped like an eagle, had given her something before he passed away in the dark. Patton's posture stiffened. He remembered that ring. It belonged to Lieutenant Robert Vance, the son of an old friend from Virginia, a boy who had been reported missing in action 3 months prior. The general asked where Vance was buried, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Elsa shook her head, her voice dropping lower. She said the lieutenant didn't die from his wounds. He had been taken by a rogue group of fanatical officers who refused to surrender, men who had... The general leaned over the desk, his hands pressing into the wood until his joints popped. He asked what the baby had to do with a hidden nest of fanatical holdouts. Elsa looked down at the child, who had finished the milk and was now breathing with a soft, steady rhythm. She whispered that the baby's mother was a young Frenchwoman, a forced laborer who had been kept in the same facility. Before she was marched away into the Eastern Territory by the fleeing guards, she had given birth in the dark, begging Elsa to hide the child from the officers who viewed it as a liability to be eliminated. The lieutenant, before he was moved into the tunnels, had sworn to Elsa that if the child survived, his commander would recognize the name inscribed on the back of his silver watch. Elsa reached into the pocket of her oversized coat and pulled out a small, tarnished object, placing it carefully on the desk. It was a heavy silver pocket watch, its crystal cracked but its casing intact. Patton picked it up, his thumb brushing against the engraved initials on the back. It was indeed Vance's watch, a piece of home that had traveled across the Atlantic only to end up in the mud of a ruined empire. But as Patton opened the back casing, his breath caught. Inside wasn't just a manufacturer's mark. There was a tiny, hand-drawn map scratched into the metal with a pen, detailing the ventilation shafts of the old brewery tunnels. The general realized that the girl hadn't just been begging for food. She had braved the patrols and the ruins to deliver the key to a prison that his scouts hadn't even discovered. He stood up, his eyes ablaze with the fire of a man who finally had a target. He called for Miller, ordering him to mobilize a specialized tactical squad immediately. He told Elsa she would stay in the office under guard, promising that if her information was true, she and the child would have a safe passage out of the zone. But if she was leading his men into a trap, He warned her that not even the child would save her from the consequences. Elsa didn't flinch. She simply looked at him and said she had already lost everything she loved, and that the only thing keeping her alive was the promise she made to a dying man in the dark. As Patton turned to leave, he glanced back at the baby, who was now sleeping peacefully under the clean wool blanket. For a fleeting second, the hard lines around the general's mouth softened, replaced by the heavy burden of a man who carried the weight of thousands of lives on his shoulders. He closed the door behind him, the sound of his boots echoing down the hallway like the drums of an approaching storm. The rain had turned into a sleet that stung the skin as Patton's strike team moved toward the abandoned brewery on the northern ridge. The building was a blackened skeleton of iron beams and shattered vats, a monument to a world that had destroyed itself. The men moved like shadows, their weapons raised, their breaths forming white plumes in the freezing air. Patton walked among them, refusing to stay in the rear, his presence an unyielding force that drove his soldiers forward despite the exhaustion clinging to their bones. They found the entrance to the ventilation shaft exactly where the scratched map had indicated, a rusted iron grate hidden beneath a pile of charred timbers. As the soldiers pried the grate open, a gust of foul, stagnant air rushed out, carrying the scent of rot and old gunpowder. They descended into the blackness, using hooded flashlights that cut thin beams through the heavy dust. The tunnels were silent, a labyrinth of concrete and brick that felt more like a tomb than a fortification. Patton led the way, his hand never leaving his sidearm, his ears strained for the slightest sound of movement. After what felt like hours of navigating the damp corridors, they heard it, a faint, rhythmic scraping sound coming from behind a heavy steel-reinforced door at the end of a long gallery. Miller moved forward with a crowbar, his muscles straining as he wedged the tool into the frame. With a loud, metallic crack that echoed like a gunshot through the tunnels, the door gave way. The soldiers rushed inside, their flashlights illuminating a scene that made even the battle-hardened veterans hold their breath. In the center of a damp concrete room, huddled around a single, dying brazier, were 5 men. 3 of them wore the remnants of American uniforms, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollowed out by months of captivity. Standing over them were 2 men in tattered black coats, their pistols raised, their faces twisted into masks of desperate defiance. Before the rogue officers could pull their triggers, a volley of shots shattered the silence of the room. The 2 captors collapsed into the dust, their weapons clattering against the floor. Patton stepped through the smoke, his gaze instantly locking onto the youngest of the prisoners, who was staring up at him with disbelief. It was Lieutenant Vance, his body emaciated but his spirit unbroken. He tried to stand, to offer a proper salute to his commander, but his legs gave out beneath him. Patton caught the young man before he hit the ground, his massive arms wrapping around the soldier with a fierce, protective grip. The rescue was swift, the survivors carried out into the pale morning light that was finally breaking through the clouds. As the ambulances sped away toward the field hospital, Patton stood in the courtyard of the brewery, the silver watch heavy in his palm. He looked back toward the city, knowing that the battle was over, but the war for the souls of the survivors was still being fought in every ruined kitchen and dark cellar. He returned to the headquarters villa, his face lined with deep exhaustion, but his steps purposeful. He walked back into the small office where Elsa was waiting. She was still sitting in the chair, her arms cradled around the sleeping child, her eyes fixed on the door. When she saw Patton enter alone, her breath hitched, her fingers tightening on the blanket. Patton walked over to the desk, placed the silver watch in front of her, and looked into her eyes. He told her that the lieutenant was alive, and that the men she had protected were on their way home. He saw the tension drain from her body, her shoulders sagging as she let out a long, shuddering sob of relief. The general sat down across from her, his voice losing its harsh edge, replaced by a quiet, commanding solemnity. He told her that he had spent his entire life studying the art of war, believing that victories were won by armies, tanks, and grand strategies. But looking at her, a girl who had risked everything for a child that wasn't hers and for men who were supposed to be her enemies, he realized something else. He said that true strength didn't belong to the ones who built empires of ash, but to the ones who refused to let the fire of humanity go out in the dark. Patton stood up, pulling a signed document from his pocket and placing it next to the watch. It was an official military transport order, securing her safe passage, housing, and medical care in the American zone, along with a permanent supply of food and medicine for the child. He looked at the baby one last time, seeing a future that had been bought with a bravery that no medal could ever fully honor. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the brass handle, and looked back at the girl who had changed the way a general viewed the world. He told her that the uniform a person wears only lasts for a season, but the choices they make when the world is burning are what echo into eternity.